guys, welcome to the weekly gut check. This is Alyssa, and today we're diving into a topic that it affects many of us, and it is especially relevant in my life because it's something that I deal with personally. So the topic is acid reflux, and I know that a lot of you deal with it because my blog post on acid reflux is the blog post that brings in the most traffic to my website. So that tells me that it's a very popular topic, and it's probably how a lot of you found me who are in this group watching this. We know certain foods cause acid reflux, or we suspect they do. So I'm going to clarify what foods trigger acid reflux, but we'll also talk about what causes acid reflux. It's really actually not the foods. Foods can trigger it, but what actually causes acid reflux, and then what you can avoid to calm the reflux down, and what you can do to soothe and heal that poor inflamed tissue in your esophagus and your stomach. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience with acid reflux. I didn't have any gut issues, nothing noticeable anyway, until I started my private practice 11 years ago. And there was so much stress involved in leaving your job, starting a new business, starting a new specialty at the same time. And now I know, looking back, the stress is what triggered it for me. And I remember it starting because I was driving home from work one day and I just thought, oh, I'm getting sick. I have a sore throat. But the sore throat never went away. And in fact, it got worse and worse and worse. It was on fire. I mean, all the time. I couldn't sleep at night because I couldn't stop coughing. I had this persistent cough. I remember it just kind of felt like there was always fluid pooled right here. And just so you guys know, the symptoms of acid reflux and GERD can be different for different people. So just because you don't have everything I might be describing doesn't mean that you don't have the same sort of issue going on. The other thing that I had was belching, constant belching, which is really embarrassing and inappropriate in certain situations. And when I would belch, I would have this sharp pain. And sometimes I would have this sharp pain right here in my sternum without even belching. It was absolutely miserable, especially when you think about not getting any sleep because I couldn't stop coughing. Think about when you're sick and you have that persistent cough. So long story short, took me a while to figure out what my food triggers were. This actually ended up kind of revolutionizing my digestive health practice because I figured out what my triggers were, but then I was miserable having to avoid my favorite foods because among the foods that really worsened my symptoms were onions and red sauce and citrus and just a lot of the foods that I loved eating. So that really led me to think about, this sucks. What can I do other than just limit my diet to control these symptoms? And by the way, limiting my diet helped, but I still had the symptoms. So it still wasn't even enough for me. So that led me to look at really my stress level. And I realized I was in this stress mode, almost like holding my breath all the time. I think I must have been holding a lot of tension through here. We also know that stress interferes with the brain communicating with the gut. So it actually affects your gut motility, which includes how quickly the stomach empties, and it affects your gastric secretion production. So that can cause symptoms. So let's break down the three kind of major causes of foods triggering reflux. And then we'll talk about the actual causes of acid reflux. But the way that foods can trigger reflux, we break it down into three different ways. There are foods that relax the lower esophageal sphincter. That's the little sphincter between your esophagus and your stomach that's supposed to stay closed and keep the acid in your stomach. So obviously you swallow, it opens, and then it's supposed to stay tightly closed. Well, certain foods can relax it. That may not be happening in a pronounced way for lots of people, but when you have this gut-brain connection, so stress interfering with the gut and brain communicating, then it may not be working as well as it should. So we'll talk about what foods relax the lower esophageal sphincter in a second, but that's one way that you can get reflux because that sphincter relaxes and so the acid comes back up. Another way is that, and this can be especially if you kind of feel that heartburn or that burning pain, it can be irritation, just irritation from spicy foods and acidic foods like citrus and tomatoes. So especially if you have kind of this chronic acid refluxing back up, then spicy foods and citrus, they just irritate that already inflamed tissue. So that's the second thing. And the third way that foods can trigger reflux is delayed gastric emptying. Certain foods take longer to digest, and they cause whatever you've eaten to sit in your stomach longer. And those are high fiber foods and high fat foods. And, high fiber foods are good for you. Fat to a certain extent is good for you. But if you've eaten a meal that's really high in fiber or really high in fat, or even worse, both, that can just sit there and it just takes a long time to empty. And the longer food is sitting there, the more pressure it puts on that lower esophageal sphincter, and the more likely it is to reflux back up. I remember a story. My family goes to Greer, Arizona, which is up in the mountains every once a year for a reunion. And, it's kind of a food fest. We all cook there, and there's lots of great food. And we had lunch. It was a big lunch. And then I had taken my fiber supplement really close to lunch. And we went out on a walk, and I was just belching. And this was years after. I mean, this was like only a couple of years ago. This was years after when I started my private practice and first had my reflux flare up. That was 11 years ago. Since then, it's pretty managed most of the time. It's definitely managed most of the time. But this time in Greer, we go for a family walk, and I was just belching just constantly, and my stomach didn't feel good. The belching was getting worse and worse. My stomach didn't feel good. I started feeling pain, and I was thinking, what in the world is going on? Because I don't live like this anymore. And I realized it because we had had that heavy meal, that high fat meal, and I had taken my fiber supplement. And then, of course, we're moving and on top of it. I can still have flares if I'm not careful. And those are the types of things that can cause it. So now let's talk about the trigger foods. I broke it down into the 3 categories of what encompasses trigger foods. So here are the top trigger foods that either loosen the lower esophageal sphincter. They're either high fat or they can cause that irritation. A lot of you might know these by heart. They're the typical GERD triggers: citrus foods and juices, tomatoes and tomato-based products, chocolate, mint, coffee and tea, spicy foods, fatty or fried foods, onion and garlic, carbonated beverages, and alcohol. So that's like the saddest list in the world, right? It's like, why live if you have to avoid all of these foods? So that's really what kind of transformed my practice into focusing on what's going on? Why am I having this problem? And how can I solve it so I can go back to eating these foods? By the way, I can eat all of these foods now, with the exception of if there's a ton of onion in a recipe, like say a recipe called for 2 onions in it, and I eat equivalent of half an onion, that will trigger me. But aside from that, I can eat everything and do eat everything on that list now because I've addressed the root cause and healed my gut. And that's what I want for you guys too. But if you are having the symptoms, here are some foods that are not going to trigger you. So that's going to be non-citrus fruits like banana, melons, and apples. So non-acidic, non-citrus, kind of mild fruits. Vegetables, most vegetables are okay as long as it's not tomatoes or onion or garlic. So leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, carrots, lean protein, so not really heavy fatty meats, but leaner proteins like skinless poultry, fish, lean ground turkey, lean cuts of beef or pork, whole grains, including oatmeal, brown rice, whole grain bread, healthy fats in moderation. So fats fine. In general, I was just talking about really high fat meals where it's either fried or maybe there's multiple high fat ingredients in the same meal. Healthy fats include avocado, olive oil, nuts, things like that. Those are good to eat. Low fat dairy options would be yogurt, kefir, skim milk if you can tolerate lactose, or dairy alternatives if you don't do well with dairy. Herbs and spices, again, aside from onion and garlic or anything really spicy. So ones that would be better for acid reflux are turmeric, dill, chives, parsley, fennel. There are actually quite a lot, just seasonings that are not spicy. And then non-caffeinated beverages and non-carbonated beverages like water, herbal teas. There are so many herbal teas. And then also juices are okay as long as they're non-citrus. So like grape juice, apple juice, maybe watered down so it's not so sugary, but those would be okay for your reflux. Now, let's go beyond what foods are safe that aren't going to trigger you. Let's talk about foods that actually provide relief and healing and help to soothe that inflamed tissue. There are a few foods that are therapeutic for this because, again, with acid reflux, we have inflamed tissue in the esophagus, but we can also have inflammation in the stomach. And so some foods that soothe that, one would be bone broth. Bone broth has collagen in it, and it really helps to support and soothe that gut lining. Another one is turmeric. Turmeric is really good for anti-inflammatory, so it can help calm down that inflammation. Another one is papaya. Papaya actually has natural digestive enzymes, so it can help kind of break that food down and move it out of your stomach more quickly. And some of my favorites here are the mucilaginous foods. And these are foods that help you to build up that mucus coating that protects the stomach and esophagus. And so that includes aloe vera juice. Aloe vera juice helps to stimulate that protective layer, kind of coat the esophagus and stomach, and it also reduces inflammation. And then a couple others are marshmallow root or slippery elm tea. One of my favorite teas has both of these in it, and I just love sipping on that if I ever do have a little bit of feel that sore throat or that reflux feeling. I sip on some marshmallow root or slippery elm tea. Now, I do have all of this put together in a guide for you guys. I've created a 7-day acid reflux meal plan. It includes foods that won't trigger you, and then it also laces in some of these soothing and healing foods. So I'm going to put the link to that in the comments.